Thank you. It's really a pleasure to give a talk at this symposium, and it's a delight to come to Sicsso each year. And I want to, again, thank all the sponsors and the scientific committee, and especially Enzo, of course. Okay, I've been tasked with giving you a DMEC update, but in reality, after this entire Congress, you've already had your DMEC update, so I'm going to be summarizing what other people have already said with a little bit of a twist. Here are my disclosures. I'm going to talk about the off-label use of these. Okay, just the overview, the concept that we've come so far. We've come so far in 17 years from doing hand dissections of tissue to doing microkeratome resections, and now we're just doing pure anatomic replacement with DMEC surgery. It was amazing to me that even though we did the first transplant of endothelial keratoplasty in March of 2000 in the United States, it wasn't until 2011, 11 years later, that we actually made the cross from doing more EK than doing more PK. And although there has been an explosive growth in DMEC, the absolute numbers are actually really small. If you look in the United States, we do 28,000 EKs or so a year, but only 6,000 in 2016. Only 6,000 of those were DMEC cases. And that represents about 13% of all the transplants in the United States were DMEC in 2016. I wrote this editorial and published it about 5 years ago, asking the question, why aren't we all doing DMEC? What's wrong with us? It's a better procedure, but we're not doing it. And those questions, even though this was written 6 years ago and published 5 years ago, those are the same questions we're asking now of our surgeons in the United States. Why aren't you doing DMEC, and why is it so slow to take off? And they still say the learning curve is still thought to be too steep. Not all eye banks are providing pre-stripped tissue, but more and more are. They say, well, gee whiz, why should I learn this now when you're showing me all these different ways of doing DMEC? The surgical techniques are still evolving, so I want to wait until I've got the best computer, the best technique, which will never happen because it always gets better. And then also, non-transplant therapies are emerging. So why should I learn how to do DMEC when I probably am not going to need to do it at all? Well, in terms of my DMEC update on the surgical procedure itself, there really, in my mind, are only two alternatives for DMEC insertion now that have emerged. One is the classic technique that you see in the wet labs and that is the most common, and that is where you take the scroll and it rolls up with the endothelium on the outside and you inject it inside the eye and unscroll it and make sure it's not upside down and put it up into position with tapping or with other manipulations. But what has emerged also is a pull-through placement of the tissue into the anterior chamber with the endothelium on the inside. And this is thought to hopefully give us more protection of the endothelium than what we have with our current technique. I'll get into that in just a second. I think one of the other things that's happening with DMEC advancement is to make it easier and safer for the surgeon. And our eye banks have taken the role on making it easier, faster, and safer. And the technique that we've been using at Devers Eye Institute for the last 3 or 4 months now is to have tissue that is pre-stripped, pre-stained, pre-marked, and now pre-loaded. And so this saves us time in the operating room, but it also makes it incredibly safe and easy for us to do the surgery, since all we have to do is just inject the tissue and it's all ready to go. I think we'll be seeing more and more of this being done in the United States and abroad. Well, here are some results of endo out, that's classic technique of putting the tissue inside the eye. And this is a paper that was published by one of my former fellows, Paul Phillips, he was our fellow 7 or 8 years ago, and he'd never learned how to do DMEC. And he came back to spend just 2 or 3 days with us to learn how to do DMEC surgery. And then he kept track of his first 100 cases using a standardized technique. And what he published in the journal Cornea just a couple of months ago was that the vision was 20/20 or better at 6 months in 55% of the cases. His rebubble rate with the endothelium on the outside is 5%. Graft failure rate was 1%. And endothelial cell loss at 6 months was 32%. Now this was 100 consecutive patients of his very first patients. very first patients. So he was not an accomplished, experienced DMEC surgeon, but he was using a very standardized technique. And so in terms of the hesitancy to adapt DMEC surgery because the surgical procedure has not been standardized, I think that's not true anymore. We have standardized techniques that work. But this is the endo-in technique, and this video is courtesy of Donald Tan, who'll be presenting right after me, where we take a dissect graft that has been pre-stripped, or you've stripped it yourself, and you put it into the Tan endoglide, and then you fold it with the endothelium side on the endothelium on the inside. So he's putting some protective viscoelastic on the surface of the endothelium here. And Donald, once again, thank you for this. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder from the next talk. And then you take this just as you would with a pull-through dissect, and you pull the entire lenticule with the Descemet's membrane on it. And the endothelium you see is being put on the inside. And you pull it through and get it ready. And then, of course, when you put it inside the eye, you have to flip the entire instrument over, so you're putting endothelium in on the downside. So this has been flipped over. Now he's taking his cross-chamber forceps and grabbing both the donor Descemet's and the donor posterior stroma lenticule, like a dissect graft, into the area. And then he's grabbing just the membrane, wiggling it to free it up, and pulling it, just the membrane, through into the anterior chamber. He's got an anterior chamber maintainer, as you can see, next to his wound, and pulling just the membrane in the anterior chamber. This is going to start to unfold naturally with the endothelium trying to make it on the outside, but what happens is it unfolds up against the stroma, which traps it. He then puts an air bubble in there, and it unfolds very easily and quickly onto the stromal surface. So I think this is a very elegant method of delivering the tissue. The question is easier? That's another question. I've done this in the laboratory, and that's when I was convinced that Donald Tan is a much superior surgeon than I am, because I had a heck of a time trying to do this easily. Eventually got the hang of it, but it's not easy for when you're starting out. Donald provided me with his results on his first 50 cases, and the vision was 20/20 or better at 6 months and 44%. Rebubble rate was 2%. Graft failure rate was 2%. Endothelial cell loss at 6 months was 30%. Now, these numbers are extraordinarily close to what we're getting with the endo-out technique. But what's fascinating to me is that his population of patients was much more complex than the population that Paul Phillips and I do with my endo-out technique. With my endo-out technique, I was doing it on Fuchs dystrophy patients, failed penetrating keratoplasties, tubes and trabs, fine. But he was doing this in eyes with an ACIOL. He was doing this in eyes that I would never do a DMEC endo-out, tapping it open on an anterior chamber IOL. But Donald did that on these cases, he did tubes and trabs and such, and possibly even a phakic eyes. So I think it opens up, this endo-in technique opens up another category of complex cases for us that we didn't have available. And so it might be harder to learn in some ways, but it also might be a way that we can now broaden our methods. And then I'm going to go very quickly on this because you've already seen Katerina do a beautiful presentation on the uncertain future of endothelial keratoplasty. What could be better than this? Well, surgery but no transplant. And there's now a series of studies on removing Descemet's membrane and not putting the transplant in there. But the problems right now are still it takes weeks or months for the corneas to clear, and there's really no guarantee that they're all going to clear. Even in some of your Fuchs patients, they don't all clear. The final central cell counts are very low in most cases. But Kathy Colby does say that, show that she has patients that are over 3 years out that have stayed clear. However, the report by Lee and Monures had in cornea in 2016 last year showed that they had an eye that they did a descemetorexis. It did clear, but then it failed later. And so it's uncertain in my mind whether or not this descemetorexis can be predictable on long term. And then you see these photographs that Kathy's published that it does work. And what's better than that is no surgery at all, simply doing the cell transplantation with ROCK and with ROCK inhibitors. And you've already seen this information from Kinoshita-san. This paper that Greg Maloney published just this last May, my time is up, I guess, is, I think, a fascinating paper because he combined the best of all worlds. He stripped off Descemet's membrane, and then on the eyes that did not clear, he applied Rapazidil and got those eyes to clear, at least all but one of them. And one eye did require a DMEC. But I think that we are still working out the issues of the use of ROCK inhibitor with desmotorexis. So in conclusion, the evolution of corneal transplantation really, I mean, think about it, 17 years, and we've just made a quantum leap in our ability to rehabilitate our patients. It's astounding to me. I think in DMEC surgery, we have truly shortened the learning curve so that you can learn this in about 2 or 3 days, a procedure that's standardized, and get excellent results like Paul Phillips did. The eye banks, the processing of the DMEC donors has been critical to the widespread acceptance of endothelial keratoplasty in general, but especially now DMEC. And with the techniques of pre-stain, preloaded, all this, it's making the surgery much faster and easier. The endo-in technique, I think, of DMEC is exciting. It opens up more complex cases of DMEC surgery. And then understanding endothelial wound healing and recognizing acceptable candidates for Descemet's membrane excision without transplants. It does open a realm of therapeutic options, but we do need to learn more on what our selection is for those patients. Well, as you know, I always thank and give tribute to my family for their support over these last 17 years. So I thank Charlie, who's with me. Here you see him without his beard, which I think makes him look much better. And my son Nicholas and my wife Cindy, and thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks.